The look on my son David's face when the lawyer leaned forward and adjusted his spectacles, I'll carry that image to my grave. It was a mixture of confusion, arrogance, and a slowly dawning realization that the floor was about to drop out from under him. For 20 years, David and my daughter Sarah had treated me like a reliable ATM with a failing battery. They thought they had finally cornered the old man. They thought that by dragging me into a cold, sterile conference room in downtown Chicago, they could force my hand and claim what they called their rightful share. They never once considered that I might have a plan of my own. They never once thought that the man who built a $4 million empire from a single lathe in a rented garage might be 2 steps ahead of them. But to understand why David was suddenly turning the color of unbaked dough, and why my daughter was clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver, I need to take you back to the beginning. I spent 42 years building Miller's precision machining. I started it in 1982 with a second-hand milling machine and a debt that kept me awake until 4 in the morning every single night. My wife Martha, God rest her soul, was the backbone of the operation. She handled the books while I handled the steel. We didn't take a vacation for the first decade. We didn't buy new cars. We poured every cent back into the business so our children would never know the kind of hunger I felt as a kid. I worked 80-hour weeks, my hands permanently stained with industrial coolant and grease, just so David and Sarah could have the best of everything. Private schools, club soccer, Ivy League tuitions, I paid for it all without a second thought. I thought I was building a legacy. I thought I was giving them a head start. What I was actually doing, it turns out, was feeding a pair of monsters who would eventually decide that waiting for me to die was taking entirely too long. The first crack in the foundation appeared about 5 years ago, shortly after Martha passed. The house felt too big and too quiet. I decided it was time to slow down. I'd reached 70 and the shop was running like a Swiss watch. That's when David started dropping by. He didn't come to check on my health or ask if I needed anything. He came with business plans. He wanted me to pivot the machine shop into a tech incubator. He told me I was stuck in the mud and that my methods were prehistoric. He was 40 then, living off a consulting business that I had essentially funded, and he looked down his nose at the very machines that had bought his $500,000 condo. Then there was Sarah. She'd married a man named Mark, a wealth manager who wore suits that cost more than my first truck and spoke in a tone of voice that suggested he was doing me a favor by breathing my air. At Thanksgiving 3 years ago, Mark sat at my table, drank my 20-year-old scotch, and had the audacity to ask me what my exit strategy was. He didn't mean my retirement. He meant how I planned to distribute my assets while I was still of sound mind. I laughed it off then, thinking it was just a clumsy attempt at conversation. That should have been my wake-up call. But I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that they were just worried about my future. I wanted to believe my children loved me more than my ledger. The disrespect didn't stay subtle for long. Last year, I finally decided to sell the business. A regional conglomerate offered me $4 million for the land, the equipment, and the contracts. It was a fair price, more than enough for me to live comfortably and leave a healthy inheritance behind. When the news broke, you would have thought I'd won the lottery and they held the tickets. The check-in calls became daily. Suddenly, David and Sarah were very concerned about my stress levels. Dad, Sarah said over lunch she expected me to pay for. Selling the business is a lot of liquid capital. Mark says it's dangerous for one person to manage that much at your age. You could be a target for scammers. We think it's best if we set up a family trust where David and I have oversight. I looked at her, my little girl, and saw only greed. I told them no. I told them I'd managed my money just fine for 40 years and I'd continue to do so. That's when the mask slipped. David told me I was being selfish. He said I was hoarding the family's wealth while he was struggling to scale his business. He failed to mention that his struggle involved a leased Porsche and a membership at a country club he couldn't afford. If that was all, I probably would have just been disappointed. I might have just limited my contact with them. But then came my 72nd birthday. I'd invited them over for a small dinner. They didn't bring a gift. They didn't even bring a card. Instead, they brought a folder. They sought me down in my own living room and presented me with a voluntary conservatorship agreement. They wanted me to sign over my power of attorney and move into a luxury senior living community they'd already picked out. They told me it was for my own good, while Mark stood in the corner checking his watch, already calculating his commission on my $4 million.
And that's when I realized they didn't see me as their father. They saw me as a bank account with a heartbeat. They were tired of waiting for the inheritance. They wanted it now, early, as if the money I had bled and sweated for was a debt I owed them for the privilege of being their parent. Something in me shifted that day. I didn't yell, I didn't get angry. I looked at the papers, looked at their expectant faces, and simply said, I'll think about it. They left thinking they'd won. They left thinking the old man was finally breaking. But the moment their taillights disappeared down the driveway, I picked up the phone. I didn't call a moving company. I called my attorney, Arthur Henderson, a man I'd known since we were both starting out, a man who knew exactly what it took to build something from nothing. Arthur, I said, it's time. We're going to finalize the sale of the business, but I need to make some very specific adjustments to the family trust. I want to include a very particular clause. Let's call it the gratitude provision. I spent the next 2 months getting everything in order. I played the part of the aging, compliant father to perfection. I took their calls, I listened to their advice on how to invest the $4 million, and I let them believe I was moving toward their plan. Meanwhile, they did the unthinkable. Tired of my stalling, David and Sarah filed a civil suit for pre-inheritance distribution, claiming that I was showing signs of cognitive decline and was frittering away the family estate. They actually sued their own father to get their hands on the money while I was still breathing. They thought a lawsuit would scare me into a settlement. They had no idea what was coming. None of them did. That brings us back to the conference room, 2 weeks ago. The air was cold, the lighting was fluorescent, and the tension was palpable. David was there with his expensive haircut, and Sarah was next to him looking at her nails. Their lawyer, as sharp in a pinstripe suit, started the meeting with a condescending tone. Mr. Miller, he said, my clients would prefer to settle this quietly. They love you, but they are concerned. If you agree to distribute 50% of the business sale proceeds now, $2 million split between them, they will drop the competency suit and allow you to retain the house. I sat there, calm as a pond in July. I looked at David. Is this what you want, son? You want to sue me for the money I made before I'm even gone?
David didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. It's not a suit, Dad. It's an early inheritance. We have needs now. You're just sitting on it. I nodded slowly. I turned to my lawyer. Arthur, I think it's time. Shall we read the clause? The shark across the table scoffed. What clause? We've reviewed the 2015 trust documents. Ah, Arthur Henderson said, a small predatory smile playing on his lips. But you haven't seen the 2024 amendment filed immediately after the sale of the business. You see, Mr. Miller had a very specific concern about the integrity of his heirs. Arthur pulled a document from his briefcase and began to read. His voice was steady, filling the room like a tolling bell. Section 12, paragraph B, the no contest and ingratitude clause. It states that any beneficiary who initiates legal action against the grantor, challenges the grantor's mental capacity for financial gain, or attempts to compel a distribution of assets prior to the grantor's death shall be immediately and irrevocably disinherited. The room went dead silent. The smirk on David's face didn't just fade, it evaporated. He looked at his lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in the fine print of the document Arthur had just handed him. Wait, Sarah stammered, her voice rising an octave. What does disinherited mean? That's not... You can't do that. I already did, I said, my voice quiet and firm. The moment you filed that suit, the clause was triggered. By the terms of the trust you were so eager to get your hands on, your share of the inheritance has been reduced to exactly $0. Both of you. David stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. You're bluffing. This is $4 million. You can't just give it away. I'm not giving it away, I replied. The trust stipulates that in the event of disinheritance, the funds will be redirected to the Martha Miller Foundation for Vocational Training. It's already been processed. The money is gone, David. Well, gone from you. The shark lawyer looked at his clients and slowly shook his head. He knew. He'd been outplayed by an old man with a grudge and a sense of justice. Sarah started to cry, not out of sadness, but out of the pure, frantic terror of someone who had already spent money she didn't have. She probably already picked out the new kitchen and the summer home. Dad, please, she sobbed. We were just worried about you. Mark said you could get rich quicker if I was out of the way, I interrupted. I stood up, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. You thought I was weak because I was kind. You thought I was slow because I was patient. You forgot that I built a business in a world where people like you get eaten for breakfast. I walked toward the door.
But I stopped at the threshold. I turned back to look at them, my children, who had traded their father for a chance at a windfall. The house is being sold next month, I said. I've bought a small place in Florida. I'm going to spend the rest of my life traveling and making sure that every cent of that $4 million is used to help kids who actually want to work for a living. Don't bother calling. My new number is unlisted. The walk to my car was the lightest I'd felt in years. I could hear them arguing in the conference room behind me. David screaming at the lawyer, Sarah screaming at David. It was a symphony of their own making. It's been 6 months now. I'm sitting on a porch in Sarasota, watching the sunset over the Gulf. My phone doesn't ring with demands for money or fake concerns about my health. I've reconnected with some old friends, and I've even started mentoring a young man who's trying to open his own machine shop. He reminds me of myself 40 years ago, hungry, hardworking, and grateful for every bit of advice.
David and Sarah try to reach out through Arthur every now and then. David's consulting firm folded, and Sarah is reportedly going through a messy divorce with Mark, now that the early inheritance has vanished into thin air. They sent a letter last week, full of apologies and talk of family being the most important thing. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I just put it in the shredder and went back to my coffee. It's funny how they only realized the value of family once they realized the bank was closed for good. I have my peace, I have my dignity, and for the first time in a very long time, I have a life that is entirely my own. And that, I found, is worth a hell of a lot more than $4 million.